It's time for another video essay, everybody. It's been a while since I've done one. If you're a subscriber to my channel, or four of you, you've probably noticed that in between this video essay and the last one, there's been a couple of videos of me and my mate Nige fighting about in a game called Borderlands 2. I'm a colossal nerd who's been playing video games for quite a long time, and I'm also interested in psychology, so this one is about whether video games are addictive or not. There's been some discussion recently about whether video games in and of themselves and certain aspects of them, such as loot boxes and skins and things like that, can be considered addictive. So I thought I might look at it, it might make an interesting video, and also it gives me an excuse to play video games to capture footage for the background while I'm talking. This one's an original one, it's not based on anything I wrote at college, it's something that I did in my spare time while I had a couple of weeks and I just wanted to keep my brain ticking over and stay in the academic mindset before I started uni. So yeah. Are video games addictive? In 2017, the World Health Organization announced that they will be including gaming disorder in the latest revision of their International Classification of Diseases Index, considering it a disorder due to addictive behaviour, a definition previously the exclusive domain of gambling disorder. Along with this, internet gaming disorder has been included in the DSM-5 as a condition for further study, although this was not without some debate. More recently, the NHS has begun providing gaming addiction treatment at its specialised addiction treatment centres. Much of the response to the coverage of this by gamers was, shall we say, predictably defensive, with some reacting with scorn and derision, others attempting to divert focus onto other subjects, such as television or social media, and a few blaming lax parenting or outright disagreeing with the proposition that gaming can be addictive. To me, this seems like a fundamental misunderstanding of what addiction is and how it works both mentally and physically. And as someone who's both gamed since childhood and been cognizant of addictive impulses within myself, I feel that it's worth looking further into the topic rather than simply dismissing it out of hand or trying to apportion blame elsewhere. In order to consider whether video games are addictive or not, we must first understand how addiction works on both physiological and psychological levels, which we can hopefully do without going too deep into neurobiology. The addictiveness of any substance is dependent on several factors, with perhaps the most notable being the method of delivery. A substance consumed has to first reach the digestive system and be absorbed in the intestines, a process which is slower than a substance which is inhaled, itself a method of delivery slower than injecting directly into a vein. Once inside the body, substances then have to reach their primary site of action, the brain. The majority of drugs will affect the levels of dopamine in the brain by encouraging its excessive production, but whether by the induction of a positive feeling or the cessation of a negative one, such as by satisfying a physical withdrawal craving, an emotional response is also induced by the release of dopamine into the brain's reward pathways, and it is this area of the brain which is key to understanding addiction to both drugs and behaviours such as gambling, shopping and gaming. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, a chemical which allows the transmission of electrical signals around the brain, which is released in the midbrain and travels along several pathways to multiple areas in the brain, and is closely associated with behavioural aspects such as our pleasure and reward responses, as well as our reactions to stimuli. It is also closely associated with the formation of memory. When you eat an especially delicious meal in a restaurant, dopamine floods your brain so that, in future, you remember what it was you ate and will seek it out again, a concept known as adaptive memory. Our memory is key to understanding our actions and reactions to different situations. We recall information based on a variety of associated factors from sight and smell to abstract associations like the music we listened to during a certain journey or the items of clothing we wore to a specific event. This is the shirt I wore during the first gig I played in 2005, and it will always be my first gig shirt, despite the multitude of times across different scenarios in which I've worn it since. A crucial role in the formation of memory is played by an area of the brain known as the hippocampus. It is here that sensory, primarily spatial, information is stored before being encoded into what is known as episodic memory, that is, our memory of specific episodes or events. It is this method by which a Madeline moment can occur following a brief scent on a breeze, or how the opening chords of a song can evoke a vivid recollection of a concert or nightclub, as well as our conscious effort to recall the events of a day by remembering a seemingly unrelated aspect, such as the state of the weather that morning. The nature of the construction of our episodic memories results in our ability to plan ahead and alter our behaviour accordingly. Were we to find ourselves in a restaurant, we could recall the last time we were in similar surroundings and thus what it was we ate, and possibly change our minds about what to order. This has implications for dopamine production, as dopamine is not only released in response to pleasurable input, but also in anticipation of pleasurable input, depending on associated cues. To carry on the restaurant metaphor, we look forward to going to our favourite establishment because we have many cognitive cues associated with previous pleasant experiences there. We know the food will be good and we anticipate it keenly when there because dopamine is being released in anticipation of the repast ahead of us. These cues are as essential to addictive behaviour as the chemical qualities of an addictive substance. For example, nicotine is typically completely removed from the body between 2 and 4 days after smoking cessation, yet many smokers report difficulty giving up or relapsing after a period of weeks, months and even years. So clearly chemical composition alone does not determine how addictive an individual may find a particular substance to be. At this point I'd like to ask my social science friends if any of them have had a Starbucks today. The anticipatory release of dopamine is contingent on both cognitive and environmental cues. It is not enough to simply think about the next hit of an addictive substance. An addict has to be in a situation where obtaining their next hit is a realistic proposition. Separate from the chemical flood upon receiving the hit, the seconds and minutes leading up to the hit could be a flurry of oscillating dopamine releases, which are a powerful influence on behaviour and crucial to our understanding of addiction as opposed to dependence. Physical withdrawal symptoms can be endured, but an addict in an environment rife with cognitive associations is going to struggle long after the physical symptoms have passed. Thus, a key aspect of addiction treatment is often seclusion in an enclosed clinical environment, such as the Priory Hospital in the UK or the Betty Ford Clinic in the USA. But with video games, separating oneself from an environment swarming with addictive cues is difficult. A core component of the vast majority of video games is a hook of some form to keep the player engaged in playing. It could be something as simple as a sequence of increasingly difficult levels or courses to challenge the player's skill, a character progression system so that the player is invested in levelling up their avatar to obtain more health or better weapons, or, more controversially, a gambling style system of loot boxes, in which rewards are dispensed randomly and the incentive is to obtain more boxes for more chances of better rewards. A brief discussion about gambling addiction is necessary at this point for 2 reasons. Firstly, because the ICD considers gaming and gambling behavioural disorders and so share many diagnostic criteria, and secondly, some aspects of many games closely resemble gambling, especially loot boxes, which authorities in both Belgium and the Netherlands have recently ruled are gambling, and thus have run afoul of these countries' gambling laws. As I was writing this essay, Finland began looking into the legality of loot boxes as well, and gambling regulators from 15 countries, plus Washington State, signed a joint statement expressing concern over loot boxes and similar practices within video games during the Gambling Regulators European Forum. Gambling addiction, also known as gambling disorder or the more severe pathological gambling, shares many behavioural similarities with drug addiction, including continued engagement in a behaviour despite negative consequences, diminishing self-control over engagement in said behaviour, and some form of craving state prior to engaging in the behaviour. The diagnostic criteria are similar, and both also show similar comorbidity patterns and genetic vulnerabilities, as well as responding to specific pharmacological treatments. Nalmefene, a drug used to treat alcohol addiction, has been used to successfully treat pathological gambling, which suggests that behavioural addictions can be treated with chemotherapeutic methods used to treat substance dependence disorders. This is more than likely due to the fact that the same areas of the brain are activated in both chemical and behavioural addictions. A 2010 study by Gudrian et al. Involving functional MRI scans found increased activity in regions of the brain responsible for motivation in problem gamblers when exposed to gambling-related visual cues, and that this was similar to cue reactivity amongst those with substance addictions, in this case heavy smokers. A 2011 study of diagnostic MRI and functional MRI imagery by Han et al. Showed higher responsiveness to gaming-related cues compared to neutral cues amongst subjects who had played a video game over a period of 10 days, while a 2013 study by Ko et al. Looking at subjects comorbid with internet gaming addiction and nicotine dependence revealed both addictions showed similar cue-induced responses and higher reactivity in the limbic regions of the brain, specifically hippocampal regions, when compared to a control group, supporting the conclusions reached by Han et al. In 2011. So far, we have mostly considered neurobiology involved in addiction, but it is important to note that behaviourist principles are also relevant to understanding addictive behaviour. Behaviourist theory posits that an individual organism's behaviour is the result of interactions with that organism's environment, with behavioural adaptations as a result of either classical or operant conditioning. Classical conditioning involves the association of an automatic response to a specific stimuli, such as Pavlov's dogs salivating at the ringing of a bell, which had previously served to announce the arrival of food. While operant conditioning sees individuals learning through a process of trial and error, with certain behaviours being encouraged through positive responses, a phenomenon known as positive reinforcement, and others discouraged through negative results. Thanks to Albert Bandura, we can also consider social learning along with classical and operant conditioning. Simply put, as humans we also learn through observing others, foregoing the need to experiment with alternative actions ourselves. It is through these principles that environmental cues can come to be associated with certain behaviours, with both positive and negative reinforcement, the removal of a negative state through a certain behaviour, such as an abstinent smoker removing their craving by smoking another cigarette, serving to shape an individual's actions and responses. A further factor to be considered alongside these principles is contiguity, that is, how closely linked in time an action and the reward is. A behaviour resulting in a pleasurable outcome is adopted much quicker if the time between the behaviour and the outcome is brief, with the inverse also being true. A child would not come to learn that a knife was sharp or a stove was hot as quickly if hours had passed between touching the object and the resulting cut or burn. Contiguity and method of delivery are also closely linked, with the faster acting drugs delivered through more immediate means tending to be more addictive, and this is also true for non-chemical behavioural addictions.
Jackpot!
A fruit machine announces a win with a flurry of lights and sounds, enhancing the dopamine rush brought on by winning a few quid. In video games, progression is similarly reinforced, with level ups or new unlocks typically being announced with bombastic flair and graphics flashing across the screen. A parade of new weapons, cars, courses or spells often follows the end of a level, or the ability to briefly choose a new perk from an expansive list of potential rewards, often known as a skill tree, serves to entice a player into spending more time with the game. These hooks keep the player engaged, a series of incremental rewards in exchange for the player's time, and while such mechanisms are plentiful, there are significantly fewer that help an individual regulate their playing time and take breaks as appropriate. Negative consequences in a game vary, from simply restarting a level to losing all progress and having to start from scratch, but in terms of behavioural consequences, these take far longer to appear, and though neglect of appetite, hygiene, sleep and social relationships seems congruent with stereotypical portrayals of video game players, the fact that these consequences have low contiguity with the activity itself means they can be easier to ignore and harder to link as detrimental outcomes in the mind of an individual addict. In extreme circumstances, however, video game addiction can lead to death. Arguably the first death definitively linked to excessive video game playing occurred in South Korea in 2002, where Kim Kyung-yae, a 24-year-old gamer, collapsed and died in an internet cafe after spending 86 hours playing games online. Since then, there have been a few more deaths linked to excessive video gaming across several countries, and internet gaming addiction is now considered a serious problem in East Asian countries like South Korea, China and Japan. Not only is a player's health potentially at risk, but so too is their wallet. The addictive nature of video games is often leveraged by developers and publishers to manipulate players into spending more money to progress further, with the previously mentioned loot boxes just one of several methods of tempting a player into coughing up their cash. The balance of gameplay can be tweaked by a developer so that a player's progress becomes slow and repetitive during later levels, once a player is invested enough in their character or the progress they've made to make giving up and stopping playing an unappealing prospect. A player then encounters a phenomenon known as grind, where progress is slowed to a crawl, yet the player persists through often tedious and repetitive gameplay in order to reach the next reward, at which point the game may offer a benefit to mitigate the grinding nature of the game, such as a boost to experience earned, for a small price. These are often touted by the publishers as optional, but can be heavily pushed in-game in key locations the player may see frequently, such as a main menu or a storefront.
What? What? Get
What?
DLC. Get it took me to the Steam store page. Fine, I'll have a regular one. What cheap was that?
This takes advantage of a psychological phenomenon known as the sunk cost bias, in which an individual continues to invest in a project or activity to justify past investment in it. Not coincidentally, similar behaviour is seen in gambling addicts, who often end up spending more money to escape debts accrued through previous gambling losses. Another impulse susceptible to exploitation is the psychological urge to avoid missing a rare opportunity. Time-limited costumes dispensed via random drops and loot boxes keep players logged in during special events, with many a game offering festive skins or Halloween themes, all sets to be collected and completed within a short period of time. After all, nobody likes missing out on a bargain, and we think nothing of retailers slashing prices for seasonal sales such as Boxing Day or back-to-school sales during summer, so common and accepted is this desire for a deal. Among gamers, the digital platform Steam is notorious for its summer and Christmas sales, with digital downloads foregoing many expenses typically associated with media such as hard copy production, storage and distribution. Products are often heavily discounted and purchases become increasingly tempting. Alongside loot boxes has been the rise of digital currencies. Games may frequently have 2 or more collectible currency systems, typically gold and gems, given to the player throughout the game, which can then be used to purchase upgrades, weapons and so on. However, the economies of the game can be balanced such so that one will be much rarer than the other, and the cost of power-ups and other benefits the player may use to progress through the game will be weighted in favour of the rarer currency, which is typically purchasable for a real-world price. A notable example of this is the mobile game Harry Potter Hogwarts Mystery, in which actions cost energy which recharges at a set rate, but can be refilled using gems the player can buy using actual currency. The game became notable because the first time the player's energy runs out sees their avatar being strangled by the Devil's Snare, at which point the player is prompted to buy more gems or spend 20 minutes waiting for their energy to refill, all the while their character is being continuously strangled. The push to drive players to pay more money for in-game items has been the cause of much controversy over the past 2 years. The game Destiny 2, developed by Bungie and published by Activision, saw an outcry after rates of experience earned after a player hit level 20, the maximum level reachable in-game, tweaked during a public event called the Clarion Call. After players hit the game's level cap, they would continue to earn experience, but this would go towards earning a Bright Engram, the game's equivalent of a loot box, which would unlock in-game items such as character emotes, weapon skins, and so on. However, during the event, players found that the experience they earned decreased the more they played, meaning they were earning less and thus receiving fewer engrams as rewards for completing missions, despite the game telling them they were earning experience at the usual rate. Bright engrams are also purchasable for real-world money, and many players felt that this was a cynical push to make players spend money instead of allowing them to repeat missions as they wished. Microtransactions, small purchases made in-game after the bigger purchase of the game itself, are a constant source of controversy as their implementation can drastically alter how a game is played, especially if the game is specifically balanced to make gameplay difficult or laborious without them. Middle-earth: Shadow of War, an open-world action-adventure game set in the Lord of the Rings universe, was so balanced towards forcing players to purchase loot boxes to unlock in-game benefits for late gameplay that the resulting controversy led to developers Monolith removing them completely in a patch release 6 months after the game itself, with a similar controversy following the release of Star Wars Battlefront 2, developed by EA DICE. Though microtransactions and loot boxes were also removed from Star Wars Battlefront 2, this was only a temporary measure, and they were later added back in for cosmetic items only, with player advancement now tied to a more linear skill tree system. Basketball 'em Up NBA 2K18, developed by Visual Concepts, has also become notable for how player progression through its My Career mode is tied to its virtual currency system, and how gameplay is negatively affected unless players spend more on this currency to level up their avatars and advance their career further. From a starting point of 60 skill points, to raise a character up to the level cap of 85 would require a player to either invest roughly 140 to 150 hours of playtime or spend almost $60 on virtual currency to buy those skill points, the same cost as the game itself. In all fairness, these decisions are often made by the publishers, not the developers, with 2K Games being responsible for NBA 2K18, EA, or Electronic Arts, being behind Star Wars Battlefront 2, Warner Bros. Interactive Entertainment publishing Middle-earth: Shadow of War, and Activision overseeing Destiny 2. Activision also courted controversy when it was revealed that a patent had been granted them regarding a specific manner of matchmaking gamers in order to encourage in-game purchases. Under their system, a player's gameplay would be monitored for such aspects as whether they played offensively or defensively, which weapons and skills they preferred to use, and so on, and these metrics would be used to place gamers in online matches with specifically chosen players who had skills, items, etc. a player would be more likely to buy in order to play better or advance further. A player might find themselves in an online game with another user who had a better weapon or a different character, the exposure to which would encourage the first player to make more purchases in order to unlock the items in question. Activision claims that the system is not in any of their games, though it is worth noting that their defense should be appended with the word "yet". When considering methods such as loot boxes and microtransactions, it should be borne in mind that we are not only discussing how mature and responsible adults may see their effect on a game, but how players conditioned to engaging in addictive behaviours may be affected. Players addicted literally have their minds rewired, their reward pathways change through years of dopamine flushes, and predatory practices such as random drops and gameplay balancing being biased towards increased purchases become greater dangers to those than they are to players better able to leave such an environment or endure the grind. In much the same way that most people who can restrict their gambling habits to the occasional flutter on the Grand National or a lottery ticket every now and then have different mental responses to gambling cues than those who will spend thousands on betting and slot machines, gamers better at balancing their time are less prone to falling victim to paying for virtual currencies to buy loot boxes to have a better chance at a preferential item drop than those who are conditioned to want to play more and progress further. Thus, the discussion should not just be about publishers wanting as much money as possible from players, but also how the drive for profit can affect those most at risk of becoming victims of such virtual shakedowns. Mechanics for manipulating gamers into spending more time with the game range from the simple and benign congratulations on unlocking the next level, faster car or bigger sword, to the more insidious purchase this virtual currency to make advancing through the game faster, or open more loot boxes to find a better power up. But that does not make video games in and of themselves addictive. The vast majority of video game players are able to enjoy their hobby in a healthy and manageable way, striking a balance between healthy playtime and other social obligations and self-care needs. This does not mean, however, that video games cannot be addictive. Like any rewarding behaviour, the potential is there for those conditioned both mentally and environmentally to become addicted. Given how new the subject is, there is comparatively little research into the effects of addiction in video game playing. However, to err on the side of caution in some extreme cases does not seem to me to be a bad thing. By all means play, but don't forget to eat, sleep and see your mates every now and then. I mentioned earlier in the video that while I was writing it, Finland had started looking into whether loot boxes were gambling or not, and while I was editing the video, a couple of things had happened that are somewhat related. First of all, EA is in a bit of trouble with the Belgian authorities. They're now being investigated because they refused to comply with a recent ruling that found that loot boxes are gambling and are subject to Belgium's gambling laws. While most of the companies involved disabled loot boxes in some way in their games, EA has refused and is now being investigated by the Belgian Public Prosecutor's Office, so keep an eye on that one. Also, an Australian Senate committee investigating whether loot boxes were gambling has published its report, and they conclude that loot boxes are, quote, psychologically akin to gambling. And they also highlight that there is a risk of gambling related harms, and I will put sources for both those things into the description below along with all my other sources. I'd like to give a shout out to Nigel because he's the one who introduced me to Steam and recently this happened, so I sort of hold him partially responsible for this. And also my friend Danielle, who recently had to ban her son for playing Fortnite on the Xbox because he spent quite a lot of her money on the game. So yeah, there you go. There's my shout outs, there's my sources. Thank you all for watching once again. Leave a comment if you found any part of this video disagreeable, or you can come find me on Twitter. Once again, as long as you're not my parents. Okay, bye.